Welcome. In this breakout room, Andrew Zoppi, Director of Compliance at CyberSheath, will provide a clear understanding of the NIST 800-171 controls that form the backbone of CMMC Level 2 compliance. Andrew will break down these controls, explain their importance, and offer practical strategies for implementation. With over 12 years of experience in cybersecurity, information technology, and cyber innovations, Andrew brings a wealth of knowledge from his diverse background in the DoD, academia, and consulting firms. Thank you for joining us today, Andrew.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join me in today's session on the blueprint of CMMC Level 2, focusing on understanding NIST 800-171 controls. My name is Andrew Zoppi. I'm the Director of Compliance here at CyberSheath. Today, I have the privilege of covering CMMC and its levels, and diving into a detailed look of NIST 800-171 controls, some of the controls that I see that a lot of companies within the DIB struggle with, and then discussing some best practices and tips, and then what you need to do to achieve your CMMC certification. So here's a quick look at our agenda for today. First, we'll start, like I was mentioning before, the CMMC. What is it? A little bit of overview, a little bit of history, and its levels. Next, we'll jump into the NIST 800-171 controls, examining each of the 14 control families in detail. And then finally, we discuss some best practice and tips to achieve your CMMC Level 2 certification. So CMMC is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. It's a framework developed by the Department of Defense to enhance cybersecurity across the defense industrial base. It is involved to address many of the growing needs and cybersecurity practices for companies that are doing business with the federal government. So how did it all start? In November of 2010, you'll see that President Barack Obama is on executive order establishing the CUI program and really giving NAR archives like the place to go to be able to get a lot of information and kind of inform and educate the government on what CUI is, but also as a resource to kind of understand what CUI is and what protections and what dissemination markers and things like that need to be as part of that information. Going into October, almost like a decade ago, you'll see now that we had the DFAR 7012 clause, which is the requirement that you see in your contracts to implement NIST 800-171 and then protection mechanisms for CUI, controlled unclassified information. Around that same time frame, or within that same year, you would have seen NIST 800-171. It went through a few revisions, right? So the revision 1 came out, and then a few years later, revision 2 came out. And now recently this year, revision 3 came out. However, everyone's still operating off of revision 2. The DoD released a memo that revision 3 will not be required at this time. That may change. Just stay present with information, keep up to date. The government will let you know when it's time to remove the revision 3. We're anticipating a grace period to implement those changes in the controls. So really for your certification as it stands today is really focusing on revision 2. Another thing that I really want to bring to your attention here is the change from a 1.0 to a 3, from 1.0 to 2.0. 1.0 was a 5-level model. A lot of websites, a lot of sources today have that 5-level model as something that they follow and they talk about. That is out-of-date information. So when you're researching the controls, or you're researching, how do I get to compliance? There's a lot of good resources out there that are still referencing the 1.0 model. Make sure that that the sources that you're looking at is the 2.0 model, which is the 3-level model that we'll dive into in other slides of the slide deck. What's the current CMMC regulatory landscape? We went through the history there. We kind of broke down CMMC, kind of the past there, but what's the current? What do you need to know today? Well, back in December of 2023, the proposed rules was released. They gave a comment period. That comment period was closed up in February of this year. The DoD reviewed that guidance and now has submitted that for final rule. OIRA has a 60 to 100-day review period. So they're going to be reviewing the rule, reviewing the comments, reviewing all of the materials. And then once they make a final rule, it's going to be published to the Federal Register, and that rule will become effective 60 days later. So if you haven't started already, now is time to start. You're going to really start seeing these things come, people asking your certification intent, your compliance structure in 2025. So really start, if you haven't started already, you really need to get after it. Start engaging with your IT teams, your hiring practices, start going through your organization and really start implementing some of these compliance and these technical controls. So what are the 3 levels of CMMC? A lot of people ask me that. Are we going to need to be at level 3, or can we just do level 1? It's really be dictated by your contract. When it comes to level 3 controls, we don't have a lot of guidance on this at this time. As more information gets released and the rule becomes final and there's more information on that, we will have a better understanding of what level 3 and what companies will need to meet level 3. We know that it's going to be all of NIST 800-171. And it's going to be controls of NIST 800-172. However, the CMMC assessment guide is still under development and has yet to be released. Now I'm going to jump down into level 1. Level 1 is the basic cyber hygiene practices that come from the FAR clause, and there's 17 controls pulled from NIST 800-171. It's basic cyber hygiene. Most companies meet that today, but you need to make sure that you have documentation around those 17 controls and make sure those things are implemented if that's the only level you need to meet. It comes right from the FAR clause. So you see the FAR clause mentioned here in the slides, FAR 52-204-21. Look your contracts, do a control F, search for that. If you see that, you got to meet these 17 controls. Now we're going to go into the level 2, which is most people have to meet. Most contracts that I see, most people that come and do business with us, most of our clients have to meet level 2. It's 110 security requirements aligned with 320 assessment objectives. It's NIST 800-171. Right now it's still revision 2. And it requires a lot of documentation, your system security plan, POAMs, trainings. It's not just technical controls, there's administrative controls as well. Once you have all of that together, you need to engage with a C3PO. That C3PO will work with your company and review your practices, your documentation, and see if you meet that level 2 certification level. So I want to break into the controls. The controls are your biggest thing that you have to meet. These NIST 800-171, it's called out in the DFAR 7012 clause. These are the things that you need to do. So NIST 800-171, it provides a framework for securing CUI within non-federal systems. It includes 14 control families, a total of 110 requirements, and 320 objectives to meet. It's 14 control families, and as you can see here, physical security, personnel security, some of these things, awareness and training, are not just technical. There are administrative and non-technical aspects of security that need to be met. As you dive into and as we go into these, you'll see there's a lot of define and identify statements. That means there's documentation, a lot of documentation, very granular documentation. You have to be very thorough and very precise. Make sure that you are really documenting everything that your company is doing to meet these controls per control. That is something that's going to really help you out. And we'll keep talking about that over and over again throughout this entire presentation because I really want to make sure I drive that home. Defining and identifying in documentation is the biggest lack that a lot of companies have when they engage with an assessor. What ends up happening is those assessors, they get your documentation package. They only are with you for the week. They're only with you for that period of time. So they're trying to get that snapshot. They're trying to understand everything you're doing. And the best way to do this is to have that compliance story documented. No matter what the control is, no matter what it is, have it documented, have it identified, and make sure you have that understanding that you can communicate that with an auditor. So let's jump into a high-level review of some of the controls. So I just want to, kind of go through some of these control families, go through a couple controls per control family, just of like what I see issues with implementation. A lot of companies overlook. This is the stuff that gives a lot of people heartburn. Some of them are easy to implement, but they just get overlooked. Some of them are harder to implement. So I just kind of want to dive in there. So the intent of access control is to ensure that only authorized individuals have access to the systems, but it's not just individuals. It's also devices and processes and services acting on behalf of individuals. So whether it's a device or a user, you need to make sure that they have they are approved for access into that system or to access to CUI, right? That computing environment. A lot of things that I see here in this control family is not defining where CUI is allowed to flow. What that looks like is a big part of CMMC is the scoping, right? So a lot of companies, they may have a test network or a manufacturing floor or something where they do not want CUI to flow to. So they put those items out of scope and they put protections in place, right, to make sure that CUI does not, go into those environments and making those environments become into scope. Something that I see here, though, is they're either not documented, right, or they're not the technical implementations are not in place. So what ends up happening is during the assessment, An assessor tests that. They say, hey, show me that you cannot RDP into the test network. And then the RDP port is open, that test network becomes available and becomes in scope. And that really hurts people within this controls and several other controls within the NIST 800-171 control families, because that area was not scoped. It was not thought about. It was not put in documentation. It was not applied, the NIST 800-171 controls. The whole point of keeping those out of scope is to not have to implement those controls because no CUI is there, and because the nature of the work and the use cases, but implementing those controls may impact the ability to perform duties within those environments. Well, if you don't have the protections in place, you don't define and control the flow of CUI with approval authorizations, whether that is a firewall or DLP or communicating, training, and things like that, the full package to make sure that CUI is controlled within that, within the environment, you brought something else into scope. And that is something that it really hurts companies when they're going for certification. Make sure that you're verifying the control of CUI. Make sure that once you implement something, you test all the opportunities of where CUI may flow in and out of, to make sure that you have the right protections in place. I want to jump into the awareness and training control family here. It's one of those administrative ones. It's intent to make sure that all users understand the security requirements, responsibilities, policies, procedures. Like, this is where you get to train your staff to make sure that they are ready and prepared to handle CUI and their protection mechanisms. A lot of people understand the controls when it comes to users and insider threat, but what ends up I see missing a lot is your privileged users. Privileged users, they somehow get a pass from doing privileged user training because of their job, right? They should know better. They should know what the responsibilities are. CMMC and NIST 800-171 says you need to make sure that they're trained to do their duties. They make sure that they are reminded that they're with their elevated permissions, that they have extra protections that they need to take, and you need to make sure that they are being trained on an annual basis to make sure that they're staying current with what's going on within the cybersecurity space. Things change. And there's better ways to do things, more secure ways to do things. We need to make sure your privileged users are getting the training that they need and an understanding of what they need to be able to do their security related duties and perform their responsibilities. Now I want to jump into the audit and accountability. The intent of this control family is to ensure that all actions within your environment is tracked and traced. This will help you with reporting, right? So within the DFARS clause, we had that 72-hour reporting period, but also with information gathering. What went wrong? What can we do to fix it? Why is something broken? Is it an attack? Is it an incident? Is it malicious? Is it unintentional? What's going on here? That way you can make sure you can detect and respond to inappropriate, unauthorized, or harmful activities. The biggest pitfall I've seen here is, when it comes to audit logs, and this control in particular, is that companies are not defining what they want in their logs. If you're a company that doesn't have a managed security provider, you need to define, okay, we are looking for privileged users, we are looking for unreasonable sign-ins, we're looking for these type of things that show like, hey, this behavior does not match up to users' general behavior. The way they're logging in, where they're logging in from doesn't make sense. You need to find that, so that way, when you're going through your logs, you can get alerts, you can get things set up in a way to make sure, okay, in the centralized tool, I have everything that I need to be able to monitor it. I have my firewall ingested, my DLP solutions, my systems, my user information, all of this stuff, all these logs are in this single pane of glass, and I have this all defined. That way I can make sure that if there's any unlawful or any breach or any incidents, I have all the information I need to submit to the DIB. So that way I know that, hey, I can meet that 72-hour reporting period. I'm staying with the audit and accountability. I just really want to show how controls relate to one another. If you haven't defined what you're trying to ingest here into your SIEM, or how you're reviewing your logs, how are you going to know what logs are failed, right? So one of the controls here is alert in event of audit logging process failure. All right, so let's say the firewall stops reporting. How are you going to know that? Do you have an alert set up? What about the VPN, right? What if the VPN's getting some pings on there that or some login attempts, but the VPN's not reporting, that connection, is not reporting to your log system? How are you going to know? You need to make sure that you've defined everything, all the sources you're supposed to have. Once you define it, then you can make sure each one is meeting the criteria and making sure that they are, alerting you in the event of a failure. Nothing's worse than something going wrong, you not getting it. And that's when you hear those big breaches, that the threat actor was within that environment for a year. How did they not know? Generally, it comes to some type of logging process failure. I really want to jump into configuration management. The intent here is to make sure that you're controlling the changes to your systems to make sure there's no unauthorized modifications that can impact your ability to handle and maintain the positive control of CUI. So a lot of companies have a really good change management process. They have change review boards, ticketing systems. They validate the stuff. They go through, they meet with board members, they meet with stakeholders, they get the change approved. However, when it comes to a lot of the changes that I see, or a lot of companies that I see when it comes to configuration management, is not employing the principle of least functionality. Everyone understands the principle of least privilege, but not so much the principle of least functionality. Systems do not need to have the same systems depending on work roles, right? Or same applications, right? So let's put this in perspective. If someone in finance does not need the same tool sets that someone in engineering does, right? So why would those applications be there? Often what we see is there's a standard build that a company deploys to an entire organization, and they do not limit functionality based on machine. Well, we need to make sure that that device only has the least functionality, or that application only has the least amount of functionality for the user that application or device is assigned to. That way, we can make sure that unnecessary services and ports aren't open, which a threat actor could leverage to, create an incident or to compromise CUI. Going into identification authentication, it's critical for verifying, the device identity, user identity, and also, authenticating them and onto your systems, making sure that the user is who they say they are and they are authenticated to be able to access those systems. So making sure you are who you are, right? One way to do that is MFA. MFA is something that is really hard also to implement depending on your use case and the way you do business. Manufacturers have a hard time implementing MFA because some of the technologies that they use on the floor don't either handle MFA well, or every time it locks out, it increases several steps, making sure you get the authenticating app, putting the PIN in, logging in when they're trying to manufacture something and have a quotas to meet. So a lot of times that's a gap in the implementation here. The other implementation that I see a lot is maybe someone's performing duties on a government site or in a SCIF, right? So in that secure area, you're unable to use like maybe Microsoft Authenticator and the phone app, right? Because you can't bring your phone into those secure spaces. Yeah, that's kind of complicated, and one of those factors that I know from my experience working at NSA, when I had to use my two-factor authentication MFA, and I had to go run out to my car to grab my stuff, it times out. You try to run back, it doesn't really work out for those users. So there's solutions for that. Maybe getting a token or like a hard token that has those things. There's workarounds for that, but not implementing it is not an excuse. You need to have a plan in place and then work through that use case to figure out a way to implement this. It's one of the harder ones to implement, and it's one that we see open on POEMs for a longer period of time. But we just work through that. That's something that's important to protect CUI. Another aspect of this, I'm going to stick within the IA family for a little bit longer here because it's all about authentication. Another part of authentication is passwords. A lot of companies do a really good job when it comes to defining password complexity, right? Upper, lowercase numbers, symbols, minimum character count. That they hit the mark on that. 10 times out of 10 that happens, right? However, something that gets overlooked in this control, and it's a documentation-based item here, is the change of characters when new passwords are created, right? So for instance, you have ABC123, 123 ABC. Yeah, it's a new password, but you're using the same characters, right? So to kind of make it more complex, make it more difficult for compromise, requiring a minimum character change is a requirement of NIST 800-171, and it's how you address this control. Microsoft natively doesn't have the technology to do that, right? So it has to be defined in documentation. Put this in your acceptable use policy, put this in your password policy, put this out there, make sure users understand that when you change a character or when IT creates a new password for you and then you have to create a new one on your first login, that you change the characters with a minimum amount that your organization defined. Incident response. The IR family is one of those ones that I enjoy just because I enjoy the premise of it, right? It's one of those controls that relates right to a contractual obligation within the DFARS clause. You have that 72-hour reporting period. A lot of companies, they take that, they see that requirement, and they create a wonderful plan. I love seeing companies that have taken this seriously. We have a good incident response plan. They have stages for recovery. They have who to report to. They have all the necessary contacts in there. The plan is well thought out. The thing that I see a lot of companies, and because it takes a lot of time, is the testing of that capability, right? How have you done a real world or an incident or a scenario based type of tabletop exercise and documented that exercise? So you have that simulation documented with an after action report of how your plan was tested, what kind of scenario you had, and have you gone through that scenario or several different scenarios to test that plan, and then any type of gaps in that plan, anywhere that you failed or things that weren't smooth, did you rectify that? Did you review that and make it better? Get the right people on the call, educate the team, make sure that those things are tested. See, what ends up happening is in the event of an incident, you have 72 hours, and you're already emotional. Your systems are being compromised. Your IT is trying to stop the spread. You don't know who to talk to first. Clients. There's a lot happening, and you have 72 hours to report to the DoD, the Defense Industrial Base. So time is not on your side. So not having a fluid plan and not testing through that, you might hit some road bumps there that will impact your ability to report or impact your ability to respond. So you really want to test it out to make sure that when you're going through an incident, it's very fluid. I want to jump real quick into maintenance. Maintenance is something that we all have to do to keep the systems and keep the lights on, right? So what happens, how do you make sure that your CUI is protected during the maintenance process? So the maintenance control family kind of addresses that. There are controls in place to make sure no matter what type of maintenance that you have, that it is done in a way that is secure and with CUI in mind. The biggest thing that I see now across the client base that we have here, or something that I see with companies that I've worked with, is that companies have a lot of agreements where systems and maintenance is done on site, right? They will not remove any information off site, or if they are a fully remote workforce, companies will come to them to perform that maintenance, right? However, they don't ever talk about in the event if they needed to send a laptop or a device off for maintenance. If you're going to send a device off for maintenance, you need to make sure it's sanitized of all CUI. Well, if you never do that, you never have any use case for that, you may not document that. And not documenting is the same as not meeting the control. Just because it's not a use case that is present today doesn't mean it shouldn't be thought about or documented. There needs to be a process in place in the event of offsite maintenance. And as part of that offsite maintenance, you need to make sure it has the right steps in place to ensure all CUI is sanitized for that maintenance activity. Want to keep on that same type of thread there, but work on a different control family. So keeping there when he talks about sanitizing and destroying CUI before release, reuse, or even offsite maintenance, media protection is all about focusing on the safeguarding CUI and storage media. So the intent of this control family is anything that is going to store CUI, it needs to be protected, right? So when let's keep going back from building off of the last control that I showed you there in maintenance. A lot of companies, could build on this control to address that maintenance control, right? So how do you do that, right? So you have processes in place, you've implemented sanitization principles, you've referenced NIST 888 revision 1, which really talks about sanitization. You have a record of sanitization, you have a process in place. What I see a lot of times, right, whether it's with maintenance or media protection, these two controls end up failing because there isn't a sanitization process in place. So what companies end up doing is, one, they don't have the documentation, so it's failing from that part. But then the other part of it, technically, they don't have any way to do the steps to perform the sanitization or the process in place, whether that's hiring a third party to do the sanitization or destruction. And they rip the drives out, they put the drives in the storage room or in storage somewhere, and they sit in the box collecting dust for months. And then there's turnover, and now there's these drives there that get compromised, misplaced, lost, and now you have a CUI incident because you don't know what's on those drives, that you have no idea what information was compromised. So you need to have a process in place to be able to sanitize and destroy information before it's released or for reuse or for maintenance. That needs to be something that's well thought through and documented. Going to jump into personnel security. This is ensuring that CUI is protected during personal actions, whether that's onboarding or offboarding. This particular control that you have on your screen is about terminations and transfers. I really want to go in here and talk about that because a lot of companies have onboarding and offboarding checklists. They handle terminations and onboarding well. The transfers is something that a lot of companies lack documentation around, or review process of permissions, whether someone gets promoted, demoted, or moves between sites, right? So maybe you have multiple sites, and someone is working in California and is now working on the East Coast, right? So they now have different programs they're assigned to. Well, their old access needs to be revisited and it needs to be removed. There any changes of that access needs to be changed. It needs to be, hey, if you're rotating between CUI projects, you don't need that old project access anymore. We're going to remove that access anymore. And that way, that makes sure you don't have any permission creep, that someone's account has multiple CUI projects that they're not working with anymore. That account gets compromised, and now you have to account for all these CUI projects. So that's something to think about when you are going through your personal actions administratively. How are you reviewing personnel permissions with IT during personal transfers? Going to jump into the physical protection. These are the physical access to your systems. The intent of this control family is to protect the physical systems from physical threats, or protect systems from physical threats, right? We live in a world that's where hybrid or fully remote workforce is really, really common, right? So CyberSheath is a fully remote workforce. There's a lot of companies that I work with that are fully remote workforce. Something that I see that's not addressed, whether in acceptable use policy or in documentation, is how our users are expected to protect CUI at alternate work sites, right? So alternate work sites could be anywhere. Telework, think about coffee shops, home office. It could be anywhere that's not your physical location. So our users, is there a plan in place to make sure, that device isn't able to be accessed from other things on the network? Are there things in place, from a physical standpoint when it comes to making sure that laptop isn't compromised by, someone walking by, kids, significant others using it? They don't have the access controls in place, right? So they don't meet the authorization to access those systems. Significant others, children should not be using workplace computers, but that needs to be addressed. Users need to be trained for that. Users sometimes take CUI home, and it might be a paper product, it might be a schematic, it might be work instructions, and they might be reviewing that documentation from a customer, from a client. When they're reviewing that, they need to make sure they know that at the end of the day, that needs to be physically locked up, needs to be secure, physically secured. All that needs to be defined on how your company is going to enforce safeguarding measures at CUI for alternate work sites. Remember, alternate work sites is anywhere that someone could be working remotely: airport, coffee shop, alternate locations. It could be WeWork sites. There's a lot of places that people go these days to work, and other outside of home offices that we need to address within that documentation. Now we're going to go into the risk assessment. Risk assessment is one of those families that is really looking at risk to CUI, risk to your organization, risk to your ability to handle CUI. Sometimes it's, it could be things like fire, or it could be flooding, it could be network outages, it could also be vulnerabilities. So a lot of people see vulnerabilities, and I'm guilty of this, right? So we get a risk assessment, it comes back. And when I worked in IT and on a help desk, I see a vulnerability and I'm like, okay, this critical one, we're going to take care of it right away. But that's an ad hoc approach, right? We need to make sure we have a systematic approach, a defined approach, that we know, hey, we're going to prioritize these risks based on compensating controls. Yeah, and we know that vulnerability is higher, but we have compensating controls in place. So even though that CV is higher, it's protected by these other things, but there's these other lower risk ones that are actually more of a higher risk for compromise that could turn into something bigger. But none of that conversation would happen without documentation, without a process, without ironing out those details. Again, I want to highlight that this may also impact things that come later in 314.1 system information integrity family that we'll address later. Not having this documented, having that proactive approach to systematically close high priority issues in that documentation generally leads to ad hoc approaches and not really remediating the vulnerability with that risk assessment. You're only looking at the CVE. You're not looking at that full risk picture, and now you're fixing things that is not fixed in the appropriate manner or appropriate prioritization. So make sure you work through those, make sure you have document those things. Again, that goes through understanding how your system is, understanding your configuration settings, but also understanding based on what risk and what vulnerability is needed to be rectified based on your configurations. Going into security assessments, this is one of my favorite control families. The CA family is something that compliance, me being director of compliance here at CyberSheath, gets to be super involved with. I love going over POAM. So this control is developing a POAM. Something that I see a lot is companies, they develop a wonderful POAM, have a lot of action items, a lot of things to fit. They have an agenda, they have a roadmap, they have dates in there. It looks great. The part of it that I see that breaks my heart every time is it's not updated. I have no idea when I see a POAM which items have been closed. Yeah, the close date has been passed. I ask, hey, has this control been implemented? And then crickets. They have no idea if it's been implemented. They have no idea if it's in place. They think it's been done. But the POAM is where you track that. The POAM is where you put that information in there. You put the reference to a ticket or whatever it is, the change request. You put that information in there, whether it's an email, so you know where you have that historic evidence that you close that control. But it also provides you with that supporting documentation of, okay, we know now on the POAM we need to update our firewall because it can't meet FIPS compliance. It can't do it. It's too old. So now we have that POAM item. We can bring that to the stakeholders. We can get the resources in place. Failing to update the plan regularly or tracking remediation efforts kind of just puts your entire compliance posture kind of up in the air because you won't really be able to talk about it defensively if you haven't been tracking the changes or the POAM items that you've been working on and closing out. And then you won't be able to talk about what is your current state or what is your progression of your compliance. You won't have that historical reference of we started out as a negative 203 and now we're at a 110. You won't have that roadmap because your POAM wasn't updated and historically kept as evidence. Going into system security plans, right? So this staying within the security assessment family here, this control is all about that SSP. A lot of things I see in the space is that SSP being created, the initial creation of it, and then never being revisited. It just sits there. The documentation becomes out of date. And sometimes it might be 3 years old when I see it. That's kind of scary to me. I know in 3 years working in IT, people get new equipment, control implementations have changed. Now your SSP is completely out of date. Now the government comes knocking at the door. They knock at the door, they say, hey, I want your SSP. You send them your SSP, and they're going to have a hard time scoping your environment because your environment has changed. Your control implementations have changed. And when an auditor is working with you, they're walking through your SSP to ask you questions to see all those control implementation details. So that SSP is kind of that North Star, that roadmap, that guide post of, okay, we are going to do, these are the things that we're doing. This is how it's done. This is our documentation. These are our authorization boundaries. I can go on, and I can get pretty excited about the SSP because if it's done right, it makes your assessment a million times easier. If it's done wrong, all of a sudden you're behind the 8 ball and you're constantly trying to figure out what was the wording there. Do you have evidence for that? Is that an old, documentation? Is that an old control implementation? Maybe you turn FIPS on, so that control that was not implemented before is now implemented. You got to make sure there's a real process to go back and make sure your SSP is being updated and accurate. System and communication protections ensures that that the security of data in transit. The intent of the control family is to protect all that information in transit, right? So let's really think about what that means. So employing FIPS validated cryptography when used is used to protect the confidentiality of CUI. So FIPS is that encryption mechanism, right? So you're making sure that it is encrypted. And a lot of times when you put that FIPS encryption on, other parts of your system may break. And that's generally the struggle, right? And then companies are like, okay, I can't turn FIPS on, or I have a system that's not FIPS validated, and I can't turn it on, and it breaks other aspects of my system, so I'm just not going to turn it on. Well, this is a control that is non-negotiable. You have to implement it. So you have to showcase this, put it on your POAM, make sure you communicate this with stakeholders because it needs to be implemented. It's a hard control to meet, but a lot of companies have a hard time implementing it because they don't have the resources or the right equipment to do so. So make sure you account for that when you go through your gap assessments. Hey, I'm going to need to upgrade some of my equipment to be able to meet this control and to get my 110 score that I need. to show my compliance. System and information integrity is the last control family that we'll talk about here. It's about identifying and correcting system flaws. You'll remember that I talked about our references control back in risk assessment family. It's identifying, reporting correct information system flaws in a timely manner. A lot of people get vulnerabilities. A lot of people get the Tenable scans, the Rapid7 scans, and they go right after an ad hoc approach, right? There needs to be a documented process to follow. You need to make sure that when you are going through these things and you see these flaws, that you have identified, reported them, and you're correcting them in a timely manner. Some companies, contract is out. Well, make sure you have SLAs. If this is a high priority item, it needs to be protected. It needs to be done in a high priority cadence, right? And if it's a low priority item, there needs to be timelines defined to when are we going to make sure this flaw is rectified. High priority, is it going to be within an hour or 2 hours, 3 hours? Low priority, is it within the next 5 business days? Those things need to be communicated. Those things need to be documented to make sure that you have a solid remediation effort. As part of that, you also need to make sure that you reference the other control families. Let's say you need to replace something, you need to change something. Well, then you need to make sure that even though you are remediating a flaw, that it's going through the change management process, that you are validating that change, that it's actually going to solve the problem and not create new problems. Now I want to jump into some best practice and tips and kind of give some actionable steps moving forward towards your certification. So what does the whole process look like? And I want to kind of put that in a 5-step process. So the 5-step process looks like this. The very first thing that you're going to do is you're going to assess your current operations with NIST 800-171. You're going to look at that stuff. You're going to assess yourself, right? You're assessing your current state. What is your current, your current compliance with NIST 800-171? Where is your current, documentation? Is it adequate? Is it good enough? When you do that, you're going to document all your findings, all your current control implementation information. You're going to put all of that implementation details, your boundary diagrams. You're going to get a very good understanding of what you're at today, and you're going to create that story in your system security plan. That system security plan, you're going to have everything in there, good or bad. You're going to have everything written there. Anything that's bad, not meeting the standard, that's other than satisfying that standard, you're going to make sure it's in there, but also tracking your POAM. But you want to make sure you have your current information in there today, because just because it's not adequate or not meeting the standard doesn't mean it shouldn't be documented. That way, if you get a DCMA, DIBCAC directed audit, you have a current SSP, even if that control isn't meeting the standard. You have the current control implementation details, and you have your planned implementation details. So you know what you need to do to fix it, and you know where your gaps and your holes are. You want to make sure all those things stay within that POAM, right? So all those things or those controls that you see, oh, I'm not meeting, or this documentation, even if it's not directly related with the control, maybe it's an item that you want to become more defensible. Maybe you have currently a 12-character password and you want to move it to a 14-character password, and you want to change that configuration setting. Put that in that POAM as well. Make sure all of those plans of actions are being tracked. That way you have a roadmap to a more defensible structure, and you make sure as part of that POAM activity, as you close things out, part of it is to update all the documentation that is part of that. So SSP, policy, procedures, all of those items need to be updated with what is current as things get fixed. That way, you're not trying to remember, oh yeah, I fixed that, I turned this on, I documented this, and you don't really have a fluid process, and you miss things, and then you feel like you're ready, you've done your gap assessment, you feel you're ready for that certification, and then, oh no, my documentation isn't good. Oh no, my configuration isn't right. Oh no, the verbiage here isn't right. You make sure you're documenting those. That's the first 1, 2, 3. It's getting everything together for that. Now you know where your deficiencies are. That's step 4. You know where your issues are. You're implementing at this point. You are fixing anything that you had issues with. You're starting to implement those security requirements. You're making sure that you are addressing the intent of the control. You're meeting what is written there. You've reviewed NIST 800-171 revision 2. You reviewed NIST 800-171 alpha, which is the assessment guide, and you've reviewed CMMC level 2 assessment guides, and you've made sure that you have got those controls implemented. You've met the requirements both from a documentation and technical perspective. You've addressed it in your SSP, your POAM. You've gone back through. You've reassessed your operations. You made sure you're good to go. Now you need to maintain. So things happen. You might get a acquisition, divestiture, a merger, a new project, new contract, whatever it may be. you need to maintain compliance. It means you might have to go through all these steps again to make sure that you're ready for when you engage with a C3PAO and start getting ready to sit down for your certification, that you've maintained your compliance. This will also help you with questionnaires. A lot of people get questionnaires. If you maintain your compliance, anytime those questionnaires come out from suppliers, that you can answer those without any type of issues, and that you have the correct and accurate information. So let's discuss achieving that CMMC Level 2 certification. That C3 certification, the things that you're going to need to do is you need to engage with a C3PAO. But before you do that, I just want to remind you, if you have any third parties that are helping you with your compliance structure or with your control implementation, coordinate with those third parties or service providers. A lot of times those third parties and service providers, they have connections or partners with C3PAOs, or they can point you in with assessors that they've worked with in the past or companies that they've worked with in the past. If you're not working with someone, you can go to C3PAO. There's on the Cyber AV Marketplace, there's a list of C3PAOs on there. You can choose a couple, you can reach out to them, and then you can schedule like a scoping call or pre-call coordination with them. And they will go through your specific organizational needs and talk about, your assessment, and then get ready to kind of get your documentation, and start reviewing things in there to see if you're ready to schedule that assessment. Part of that, you need to, go back through those steps again, right? Conduct a self-assessment, using the CMMC assessment guide, implement any necessary controls that you might have overlooked or might have became non-compliant based on more understanding or based on configuration changes that just kind of got overlooked. Make sure you fix those gaps. And then finally, revisit all that documentation. Every piece of documentation, every policy, every procedure, every plan, the plan of action milestones, the security plan, incident response, all of it. Just go through all of it, your training plans, every control family, all documentation. Make sure that it's up to date, make sure it's current, make sure they're clear and they read well, and that an assessor can understand that you're going to be giving that information over. That's kind of like your first gate to get through to be able to get certified, is being able to show that you're mature from a documentation standpoint. And then when you get into your assessments, whether that's an on-site or remote assessment, assessors are going to review your security practices, process, and documentation, but they're going to look at, demonstrate, your password complexity, demonstrate MFA is turned on, demonstrate and show me that FIPS is turned on. You're going to be able to have to do that. Once that happens, the CPO will submit your assessment report to the DoD. If you're satisfactory, you're going to be granted that CMM certification. You'll be able to clap your hands, breathe a big sigh of relief, because you have reached your certification that you've worked really, really hard to get. I know this is a process. This is something that takes a while to get through and something that makes people really, really nervous. So once you get there and you get that, nothing is more gratifying than achieving that CMMC certification. I want to thank you for attending today's session. I know I went through a lot there. I threw a lot of information at you. I hope you found this presentation informative and helpful. If you have any questions in achieving your CMMC certification, please reach out to sales@cybersheath.com. Again, that's sales@cybersheath.com, or click the Q&A link on the side panel, and we will be happy to help you, get the answers to those questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing a blueprint for the CMMC Level 2 controls needed to meet compliance. Please email us questions you may have on how CyberSheath can help you meet regulatory compliance.